still there. He's on paternity leave right now, so you won't see him on T right this minute, but he'll be back on in April. So
That's great.
Yeah. He just had his second child. He has a 3-year-old and now a 6-week-old.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah.
That's great.
That's funny. How about you? How are you doing?
Good.
Because I'll have to report.
No, I'm doing great. I've got an 10th grade and a son in 10th and a daughter in 6th at UAS. And my folks are
we're going to try to get your dad to come to our 50th reunion this May. We've assigned people to talk him into it and drive him up there and make sure it happens if he's willing. So,
yeah, it's a memory carrying it out. So mom's in the cottage. They were in the cottage together, but now
we got it, except I had to change the channel, so some people might get loose. Okay. We'll have it recorded.
My husband is here, but he has Alzheimer's.
Ready then?
I know exactly. I'm behind you in terms of timing, but I know exactly what you're talking about. So, yeah, in touch.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome and thank you for attending tonight's program. As always, our programs, I'm Chuck Peterson. I'm with the Programs Committee on the Granville Historical Society Board of Managers. And as always, our programs are supported with a generous donation from former Denison University President Dale T. Noble and his wife, Tina. Before we begin, I also would like to introduce or name some of the members of our Programs Committee. They are Greg Dixon, Cookie Sunkel, Nanette Macy Junes, who is here. Nanette, raise your hand. And Sam Schneid is also here, and Lynn Overholzer. So it's a very energetic committee, and I think we're going to be able to do some really good stuff. So tonight our speaker is Gill Wright Miller, a full-time faculty member at Denison from 1981 to 2022, who is presenting Add-on or Renovate, the updating of Monomoy Place. Gill is a direct descendant on her father's side of the Cooleys, Hilliers, Munsons, and Wrights. You've all heard those names, I think, who migrated from Granville, Massachusetts, and Granby, Connecticut in 1805. On her mother's side, she comes from a family of architects, did not know that, and in fact put herself through Denison as a student by renovating several houses here in Granville. So it is no surprise that her research interests and coordinate stories of the inhabitants and their homes to paint vivid pictures of those who lived, where, and did what in the development of Granville. The story of Monomoy is one such story, largely a tale of two different kinds of doctors, doctors of medicine and doctors of philosophy. So, turn it over to Gill.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, I'm actually really excited to be here, but I'm terrible at titles, so you may notice that I've kind of upgraded the title, right, to be The House on Lot 12 in 3 stages, and I'm going to divide the history of Monomoy into about a 50, 70, and 90-year increment based on the people who owned the house. My real passion is finding out who lived where and who was doing what and who lived next door by going to the census and those kinds of primary documents, and then figuring out the stories that we tell about these houses and which parts of them are more likely true and which parts are less likely true, right? So this is going to be in 3 stages. Let's see if I can do the technology. So the first stage is I call the Richards era. It's from 1813 to 1861. And I think people know probably that Granville was a planned community, that people came ahead of the 1805 founding of Granville, and they plotted out the land, and they went back and they had a lottery. People bought various placements in the lottery by exchanging. They paid $1.67 an acre for the land, but then they upped the ante a bit to get a better placement in the lottery, and people bought more than one, and they kind of tried to get up the ladder. And so we have different people owning the lot that we're looking at in particular. And I'm going to focus on, this is the original plat and then on block 8, and then lots 11 and 12. Now, this particular set of lots was owned by Augustine Munson, who happened to have been the son of Jesse Munson, and he sold it to William Richards for $80. He was the 5th owner. It had traded hands several times with nothing built on it, and he sold it for $80. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the first builder of the house that we now call Monomoy, but I'm going to try to call it the house on lot 12 until it was called Monomoy. William Richards came from New London, Connecticut. He arrived in July 1811. He was not the first doctor in town. There was a doctor named Samuel Lee who was here from 1809 to 1811. He was also from Connecticut, which presumably may have been the connection between the two, but he set off for Coshocton in 1811 and brought in a friend, dialed a friend, right? When William Richards, who came here and lived in the homes of Reverend Harris, Timothy Harris, and Judge Rose, taught at the Elias Gilman House, which is the Kappa Alpha Theta House now on the corner of Rose and Water Streets, which you and I might think of as Mulberry and College. He lived there for a few months before there was, and you may not know this, Granville made, a lot of the people in Granville made a living off of a distillery, off of making whiskey, right? And the whiskey should have been made in vats of copper, but this one was made of wood, and it blew up, it exploded, and 6 members of the community were badly burned. And the new doctor, William Richards, was able to save their lives. So 3 months after he arrived, he endeared himself to the people of Granville, and they took him in. So even though he wasn't an original person here, he became quite a reputable doctor right away. Now, the house that we're talking about in particular, you see the little red circle, or maybe you can see the little red circle. And what I want you to notice is that catty corner is the Pritchard house, where the Tridelt house is now, because that house is going to be instrumental in witnessing some of the renovation that's going on. And it was written about in Caroline Pritchard's memoir. She was a contemporary of the children in the house when it was renovated. So I just wanted you to get the placement that's going on there. Oh yeah, forgot I gave you a close-up in case you couldn't see it in the back. So there we go. All right, this is the earliest picture I could find of the house on lot 12. And here it is close up from that lot. And you see that it's a front house, which is white-ish. And then there's a middle section and a back section, and that's going to replicate itself several times in the renovations. But those particular additions were ripped off and rebuilt, but not all the way down to the foundation. And I just wanted you to see that this was from the 1850s, right? And Dr. Richards still lived in that house at the time. So he was married first to Isabella Maurer, had 4 children. Henry Livingston is going to be instrumental to remember these names, so take notes if you need to. Mary Ann Maurer, a son named William, a daughter named Isabella. And then when his eldest son Henry was just 6, almost 7, his wife Isabella died. He remarried Tryphena, which sometimes has a Y in it, but not in the oldest versions of her name. The spelling, by the way, is not particularly consistent from all these people. He remarried and had 3 more children, Peter, George, and Ebenezer. Ebenezer ended up dying when he was only 6, so we don't hear much about him. So William had 7 children in the course of about 15 years. Now, do you remember what the house looked like? The front part of the house, quite small for 2 wives and 7 children, right? So the suspicion is that he built those 2 sections on probably about 1823 or slightly thereafter, right? About 10 years into living there. Now, here's what happened. When Richards died, and by the way, he fell backwards out of a hayloft in a barn at the age of 65, hit his head and ended up dying, right? So it's not like he had been sick or anything. When he died, his eldest son, Henry, claimed that his father had made an oral agreement with him that he could have the house for $150. To which his siblings said, not hardly, right? And I'm going to show you some numbers about that helped substantiate that story. Mary Ann William, Isabella had died, but her daughter Mary and Peter, the other two, George and Ebenezer, had already died as well. Those 3 adults and 1 child sued their oldest brother and said, you can't have the house for $150. That's just not happening. And it was in the courts for a long time. By the time they couldn't reach a conclusion, the court decided that it would go to sheriff's auction. So the sheriff's auction evaluated how much the house was worth, decided it was worth about $1,250. Now you can see why the other siblings are saying, yeah, and Dad gave it to you for $150. I don't think so, right? And so it went for sheriff's auction, and of course, just as now, the minimum price was 2/3 of the appraised value, right? Which is $833.33. So it turns out that Mary Ann and her husband, V.S. Hillier, whose name was Virgil Sebring Hillier, but he went by the initials V.S., they lived in New Jersey, but he was a builder, and they came back for the auction, and they were the only people to bid on the house. There's some suspicion that the Granville Township maybe didn't want to get involved in a family matter. At any rate, Mary Ann ended up getting the house, and she and her husband renovated it extensively and then put it back on the market. I'm going to give you some numbers in a second. All right, so some people don't like numbers. I happen to love them. Appraised by the court for what we think of today as $44,000. Now you can really see why the siblings were like, Dad gave it to you for $6 when it's worth $44. Nope. The actual price paid at the auction was about $29,000 today. But when you subtract Mary Ann's share, since the proceeds were divided by 5 and she got 1/5 of it, so she was paying herself, she actually only had to come up with $23,000 to split among the other 4 contestants in the auction, right? And then the renovation that happened over the 4 years made the house able to be resold to the Fassets 4 years later for $1,700. That's about $59,000, $60,000, right? So she and her husband made a little over $35,000 less what they put into the house, right? Let's say they put $10,000 in. That's generous, right? She still made quite a profit by getting the house at the auction. So on the left of your screen, the front of house on lot 12, the Richards' original house, those 2 rooms. And then I'm going to tell you about the rest of it. These wall lines, by the way, are approximate. This is from a drawing of the basement that was in Denison's archives, but it's not like an original drawing, so I'm not sure that the walls are exactly accurate. They're accurate for what they were when Denison drew that. But here's what the foundation looks like. I call it stone on stone, but most people call it random rubble, which is one of my favorite names. Random rubble. And random rubble was picking up the stones that were on the lot that were there already and stacking them so that they would balance under the weight of the house on top. Kind of like a knob and tube, this is actually extremely sturdy, impermeable to the weather, has lots of airspace for, airflow and various kinds of moisture to dry out all on its own. There is nothing wrong with this. So if you have a house like this, keep it. Keep it. Don't decide that you need to do something more modern, because the more modern won't last nearly as long as this will. So the oldest section looked like that, and I just thought I'd quickly throw in a picture of the old oak little joist there that has some wear and tear on it, right? So that you can see that picture. And then before 1852, when Richards died, he added this addition approximately where my red lines are. And I'm guessing that he did that, A, for his growing family, and B, because his practice was growing so lively. And the back rooms were used as medical practice rooms in town, right? So we have evidence of that. I'm not sure that my lines are exactly in the right place, but some of them are, because on the far left of the red lines, you'll see, I'm going to show you what the foundation looked like. I just wanted you to see the two sections we're talking about one more time. These are now also random rubble, but they have a little bit of grout in between them. And the grouting was something that was started in about 1820, 1825. So the likelihood is this addition was built between about 1825 and 1850, 1852, but probably closer to the earlier part of that time. And I'm going to show you why I think that. Now, Marianne and her husband, V.S., when they bought the house and in 4 years renovated it and sold it for quite a profit, they made a big renovation about it. And we're going to hear about that from some firsthand experiences. But I'm guessing that the yellow part, again, approximately, the yellow part is the part that she renovated. It's my thought, because with some evidence that she tore off and rebuilt and did some changes, because the foundation in the new part looks like this, right? So we have the middle walls where my dotted lines are now. They look like the old foundation, but the outside of it, built at the same, built the renovation at the same time, has the limestone like this. And look how neat and tidy that is compared to the random rubble, right? So now we think this center, I'm going to call it the center section, was rebuilt in 1857, 58, 59, in the 4 years that Marianne had it. So William and his wives, Henry and Cynthia for a couple years there. Sheriff's auction had it for a while, right? V.S. and Marianne bought it from the auction. And then we have a transition between John and Elizabeth Fassett. There were plenty of people named Fassett here in Granville. They do not seem to be related to these Fassets at all. These Fassets were born in Canada. They came from Wisconsin. They had a daughter, Henrietta. When they moved here, they lived in the house right next door to the Follett Wright house in the 1860 census, and they bought this house in 1861. John and his father, who lived with them, were both musicians, and they fixed pianos for a living, and they were only in Granville for a handful of years before they left Granville altogether. And we couldn't find any relationship between them and the other Fassets, and there are plenty of them, even in this story coming up. So I call that a little 2-year transition period. I think you should also remember that 1860, or learn anew, between 1861 and 1863 was the Civil War, and it had come to Granville. So the resources were slim. They may have left town because they could no longer afford to pay for the house, or because they needed to be someplace else, or they wanted to escape the United States. I don't know why they left. I don't have any idea really why they left.
Are we allowed to ask questions, Gill?
Yeah.
Did the Hilliers then leave? I was just curious because I know you're going to go on to the next part of the house. After the Hilliers sell the house, did they leave Granville? Did they go back to Connecticut?
They lived in New Jersey.
New Jersey. They went back to New Jersey.
Yep. They never relived in that house.
But they never relived in Granville either. They went.
Correct.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So that's the Richards, right? So now we're on to the second stage. I'm calling it the Follett era. I'm calling it the Follett era, but some people would prefer calling it the J.S. Jones era, but I call it the Follett era. He was the son-in-law. Right? So 1863 to 1934. So the first thing I'd like to say is Dr. Alfred Follett, who's the person who, he was a doctor, but he was first living in Johnstown, was born in Enosburg, Vermont, came to live in Johnstown with his parents. They ended up moving to Granville in 1850. But the point here is that he wasn't an original person here. And he was a school teacher. While he was working on a thresher machine, the first one in Licking County, by the way, he fell, got his foot tangled in the thresher, and it got mangled. And it was mangled sufficiently that they had to amputate his foot. He was 20. So at the time, he made a life decision to change what he was doing. He no longer wanted to be a teacher. He wanted to be a doctor. Okay. So he started reading under the precept of Charles Gifford. I don't know if you know who he is, but he lived on Broadway, right across from the Fine Arts Quad. Read under him, and then went to Stern School of Medicine in Columbus, and came went to Sandusky to practice for his initial medical practice, lived there for quite a while, met and married Maria Lucinda Follett. Again, the records show Lucinda Maria or Maria Lucinda. You'll find it both ways. All the census say Maria first, but her wedding license and her death certificate both say Lucinda first. So, some confusion about what the order of her, what the order of her name is. But at any rate, he, Follett, moved back to Johnstown. Then his parents, who I just said lived here, both died, one in May and one in June. And the suspicion is he may have received an inheritance. What do you think? He and his wife, Maria, bought the house the same year that his parents died and spent 2 years renovating it. Didn't move in for 2 years. They didn't move in until 1865. They stayed living in Johnstown while they were renovating the house. And what is interesting to me is that during the course of that time, we have several firsthand accounts and memoirs from people who were watching it being built, right? Now, I'm going to get to that in 1 second. I just want to quickly say that house ended up passing from him to his wife, from his wife to his daughter, and from his daughter to her husband. Both of them, the wife and the daughter, both dying quite close to each other within about a year of each other. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is what the new residence looked like in 1866 in the Beer and Soul Atlas of Licking County. It's quite prestigious now, quite different from the house we saw earlier. I don't know that I can't tell from here if I, no, whoops, sorry. I thought maybe I was going to show you the old house again. Anyway, the roof line is completely different. You see the fence and the plantings and the trees, but also look on the east side, on the right side of your screen, you see there's an entrance that goes up to the middle of the house, and that's where, that was the doctor's office in the back there. So he and his wife had renovated the entire house, changed everything about it. No longer was the front made out of one thing and the middle and back made out of something else, even on the outside. There's clapboard all the way around. But this is also during the Civil War, right? So resources were slim. He must have had a very prestigious practice. And this is a little memoir from Caroline.
They lived in a large old-fashioned house whose timbers were oak, and when sold to be rebuilt, were found to be solid as when first put in.
So when I go down to the basement, I want to see why Caroline Pritchard, who was witnessing the 1863 to 65 renovation happen, was watching the whole thing and writing about it in her memoir, why she thought that they were using those timbers. And you can see in the joist, you see the holes that are cut out from previous crossbars. I don't know what they're called, Chris. Maybe you know what they're called. The cross beam.
Joist.
No, the top one's a joist. Is the bottom one a joist also? Okay, so the top one is the joist, but the 90-degree angle, or I don't know, let's call them sub-joists. I don't know what they're really called. I mean, we talk about I-beams now, but these were not I-beams. These were made out of wood, and they didn't have the shape of an eye. At any rate, those notches indicated that they were reused. So quickly again, the Hilliers seem to have built the wings on either side. The Folletts added the back. When they did the renovation, they added the back, and my belief is that this is the foundation of the very far back, and it's quite different than the sandstone. Even though it was only 4, 5, 6 years earlier, they've now decided putting in grout is a really good idea, right? Is it because it was newly available? Is it because we had a new way of thinking about it? Different people report different things about it. At any rate, I don't believe that the see the third picture over? I don't believe that is the same as that. So those were two different time slots, even if they were close together. Okay. Alfred Maria Follett had 3 children, right? George Pelton. Pelton was the maiden name of Maria's mother. Sarah Fidelia, that we know as Sally, and Alfred Payne, and he was known as Payne. So George, both of the boys, the eldest and the youngest, were both doctors, but George ended up contracting typhoid and dying when he was only 30. And Cain lived on College Street at 311 College Street, which is not the corner of Pearl and College, but one house in toward Newark. I have a little picture of that, I think. Yeah. That was Cain's house. That's where he lived. But the person we're interested in is Sally. Why are we interested in Sally? So Sally, the daughter, graduated from Granville Female College. She got a degree in education in the arts, and she became the assistant to the head of the college. And she ended up becoming romantically involved with John Sutphen Jones, who lived, by the way, on the same block. Now, when he moved to Granville into the Thresher House, he moved here in the 1880s, and apparently he moved in here with a companion that everybody believed was his wife, apparently not his wife. He was from Washington Courthouse. He was he was Welsh descendancy. He had one of seven children, and he moved here in the 80s. And I'm going to show you the house he was in. He was a conductor on the Toledo and Ohio Railroad. This is the Thresher House. Now I'm showing you this house. This is a picture from 1948, but I'm showing you this house. Take note because Wally Chessman's going to comment on this a little bit later when Denison becomes the owner. So some of us think of that as the first recital hall. Yeah. Not still standing. That's why Wally Chessman is going to comment on it. So the circle is where Sally Follett lived, and the star is where Thresher House was, which is where J.S. Jones lived. So they just lived across the lawn from each other, right? Lots of speculation about how he met. I won't repeat all of those stories. I can't find any firsthand evidence for any of them, but here's what's interesting. He and Sally were married in 1884, and then they moved west. They moved to Chicago, and they spent some time in Wisconsin and some other places, but they didn't live here in Granville. And then he sued the New York Coal Land Company in 1890, and apparently ran out of money. That was a very protracted lawsuit. And he and Sally moved back to Granville in 1894, likely depleted, moved in with his in-laws, not a good sign, right? And his father-in-law thought he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. Father-in-law happened to have died in 1897, and then in 1898, he won the lawsuit. It's like a David and Goliath story. It's a really, really interesting story that I won't go into tonight, but he won $589,000, which was the equivalent in 2024 of $21 million. So we think of him as the tycoon. He was first financially depleted, moved in with his in-laws. So if your kids are moving back in with you, just know that at some point they may be fine, right? Okay, so here's a picture. I circled it because it's a picture from looking on Broadway, looking west. But I wanted you to see which house was the house. This is from the Granville Historical Society, actually. And remember, it's not his house. His father-in-law has died. The house has passed to his mother-in-law. Mother-in-law's living there. He and his wife are both living there. And he lifted the roof, added the ballroom, added the wraparound porch, added the solarium. It's not his house. Can I just repeat that? I'd like a son-in-law that did that. I didn't have any girls, so that's not possible for me. Anyway, the house was gorgeous. It was just simply gorgeous. And in the meantime, he and Sally, now they have a lot of money, they bought the McCune Villa, which is we think of now as Brindou, and they started renovating Brindou, and they spent a lot of time there. And there was a, kind of the winter house in the village and the summer house out in the country, right? And they were traveling back and forth. So Maria, his mother-in-law, spent quite a bit of time at Monomoy by herself, and Sally and J.S. lived out in Brindou quite a bit, but not entirely. There was a lot of back and forth. And then in 1906, they had a New Year's Eve party, and this is the first time we see reference to the name Monomoy Place. The very first time it appears in print. The suspicion is that when JS did all of those kinds of renovation, he named the house. That is certainly when the stone was engraved, Monomoy Place. It is likely that he gave it that name because the Follets used to spend their vacations near Cape Cod on a spit of land that was the home of the Monomoy Indian tribe, which was a subculture of the, I can't remember now, I just forgot. But at any rate, he may have picked that name to honor the summer place that his mother-in-law and his wife had spent living as children. We actually don't have, there's no explanation for where the name Monomoy came from in any evidence that I can find, but this is the most reasonable thing to think about. And he named it that probably early 1900s. The first time it ever appeared in print was the January 1907 description of their New Year's Eve party. Okay, so Maria, his mother-in-law, died in 1909. Sally inherited the house, and then his wife Sally died in 1910, and J.S. inherited the house as the spouse, right? J.S. and Sally did not have any children of their own. So those of you who know Sally Jones, she's the daughter of his second wife. Wait till you hear this. He's married to a second person, a divorcee from Chicago, and she has his first baby. She had a child already. And he insists that she named their child after his first wife. I'm just going to step out of that one for a minute. At any rate, so he owned the house from 1910 to 1927 when he died, and then it was in his estate from 27 to 34. During that time that he owned the house, remember he had 6 siblings. There were 7 Welsh children in that family. He had 2 sisters. Molly, the eldest, was a spinster, and Maggie, his older sister, was a widower. And the 2 of them spent a whole lot of time at Monomoy. Remember, J.S. and Sally are spending a lot of time out at Brindou, traveling back and forth. And the 2 women are living in Monomoy and bringing in, their children, well, the children of Maggie and other kinds of relatives. So the house is kind of a revolving door for relatives, which I actually think is quite lovely. And as it turns out, in his will, he determined that upon his death, the house would be called the Sarah Follett Jones Home, a home for indigent ladies. He recognized that his wealth permitted him to take care of his 2 older sisters, but he also recognized that the culture really didn't take care of older single women. So if they didn't have any means of income, he wanted to provide that. And he left a $250,000 endowment to take care of the house and clear instructions in his will that they would, that the house would be taken care of, the taxes would be paid, the electric bill would be paid, whatever, everything would be taken care of, and they would get an allowance until they died. And Molly didn't live very long at all, but Maggie lived until 1932. So there was, 5 years in there that Maggie was living off of his income. But notice what happened between 1927 and 1932. The stock market crashed, right? So what was a ton of money turned out to be not so much. I know. I mean, is this a made-for-TV movie or what? Right? Okay, so I just wanted to quote the language in the will, which I think is so beautiful, that the house was to be strictly non-sectarian in character, that provisions be made for the care of 10 ladies at one time, and that only women be admitted who have attained the age of 60 years old and have no means of support, preferably no near relatives. Okay? Now, I just want to say a little aside here, and that is that street, Mulberry, between Broadway and College, those were all single women, 60 years old. It's amazing to me to think between the Kappa Kappa Gamma house and the Tridelt house, those smaller houses in between, single women lived in those houses. They were employees of Denison. They were the librarian. That one worked in admissions. They must have had the most incredible block parties on that street. All those single women who were 60 years old and older. Probably what made him decide he wanted the house to kind of continue the festivities for those women. So it turns out he didn't end up having enough money and in his estate. He's dead, remember, this is in his estate. And the home was sold, $18,000, and that money was divided among Children's Hospital, St. Francis Hospital, and the YMCA's of Newark and Columbus. It never came to be. Okay. Last era. Okay, Denison. Then Denison picked up that house in 1934 for that $18,000. All right, so it turns out that J.S. Jones had this propensity for acquiring land. He loved to acquire land, especially land that was contiguous to land that he already owned. And he started collecting land in 1903, particularly land on Block 7 and Block 8. Okay? And he did so discreetly and quietly, and no one knew except Emory Hunt, who was the president of Denison. They were in cahoots about this because nobody wanted to think that Denison was buying all that land. But Denison promised to buy it from him at the point in which he was ready to sell it. And so he was acquiring every piece of land there. And it turned out in 1924 that the trustees revealed that indeed Denison would acquire all of that land except Monomoy. Remember, he didn't die till 1927. And his sisters were using the house as much as anything, right? So Monomoy was not for sale then, but the rest of the 2 blocks belonged to him, sold to Denison. In 1934, 10 years later, he had already died, his coffers had been depleted, and the courts decided not to enforce his will because it was written less than a year before the day he died. And apparently there's a provision that if you write the will like too close to when you die, they don't have to decide that it was legit, or at least that was true in the 30s. So Denison was able to buy Monomoy, the house on lot 12, and the extra piece of land, lot 11, that $18,000. For what amount? That amounts to $412,000 in today's terms. I think that was a pretty good deal. Remember, he had a lot of money up till his death, and the house was kept up very, very nicely. It was not like it was in ruins. So they bought the house for the equivalent of $412, and I'm just telling you that if it went on the market for $412 today, I'd buy it for sure, for sure. Okay. So Denison owned the house, and I'm going to very quickly move through the Denison era, but I want you to see what the pattern is here. In the 30s, Denison didn't do much of anything to it. A little bit of decorating. They brought in some furniture, but it became a dormitory for women, and most of the time it was that. These are just some newspaper articles that helped me establish that, and they renamed the house Shepherdson, right? So Shepherdson Hall, Monomoy Place was now called Shepherdson Hall, right? And it was a dorm, and it became a dorm for women. I'm going to show you in a minute. Well, it's going to do that in the 50s. Sorry, in the 40s, it was all women except for a few months between July 43 and March 44 when it housed soldiers. But that's also when it became the summer theater. Right? So the summer theater people would live in that house, and they would rehearse in the ballroom up on the top, and they'd have dinners, and they had dorm space. It was perfect for Denison Summer Theater. And if you know much about the summer theater, that's a really famous block of time for Denison. Here's where they had to do some renovations if they were going to use, some safety renovations if they were going to use it. So a couple of pictures from the archives in the 40s. You see that the solarium was removed. This is Denison doing this. And I want you to take note of the center picture because it's a bevy of women on the front steps of Monomoy. You're going to see this again in the 70s, so keep your eyes open. In the 50s, it changed dramatically, but it continued to house women. The way it changed was that it became a kind of cooperative living. So the women could live there without paying room and board, but they did all of their own cooking and all of their own cleaning. There wasn't anybody there to help them. The dorm space up on the hill, those dorms were cleaned by other people, and they used the dining hall for their food, but these women got a cheaper deal at Denison if they were willing to do those things for themselves. But what I want you to notice is the steps coming to the side are going to turn around and be moved to the front. You see that renovation that they made? That's in 1951. And let's just keep track of some of the women who were living there. This is Mother's Day brunch. I'm not sure I can tell who are the students and who are the mothers. Anyway, these were women from the cooperative, and another picture of the cooperative. And one of the things that was kind of endearing about it is that the women in this cooperative decided to have faculty for dinner on Tuesdays and Sundays at noon because they thought it would be a good idea to get to know the faculty as people rather than only as teachers. That was a really rebellious idea, mind you, because they were trying to break down that superior inferior kind of. Well, okay, I'll move on. Not Monomoy. All right, 60s was the only decade that it housed men. And in the beginning of this, you'll see a culture shift here. In the beginning of the 60s, it housed the ATOs. And you can see the bell. See the bell on top of the, yeah, so the bell was really famous for quite some time. And I'll show you that the ATOs were these dapper men in coats and ties. These are students. These are students. And here's the whole group of them. And then in the late 60s, it changed. Instead of Greek men, it became the independent men. Same decade, here are the men, independence, right? Here's their collective picture from 1969. And Denison believed, oh, oops, maybe it's better to put women in this house, right? So in the 70s, they moved back to women. The men were a little too hard on the house, right? But there was a lot of delayed maintenance. Now this is you're looking from the east side. So the big trees that are on the left-hand side of the picture, those are front trees. Hard to get in the front door. Right? Here's another picture from 1974. I actually lived in this dorm in the 70s, by the way. It was in ruins. It was so much fun. Anyway, you see that it needs at least to be power washed, maybe painted, I don't know. Anyway, and here are, remember when I asked you to take account of the women who lived in it sitting on the front steps? Okay, so I actually called my colleagues. Many of the people in this picture are people I know and people I went to school with, and we're still in close contact. And I said, you guys, the lists all say it's only women, but all of the pictures have men. And they're like, yeah, don't mention that part. I was like, they're in the pictures. So, okay. So none of these men actually lived in Monomoy. And here they are in 75 and 76, just a couple. So you can see for a few years there, pretty bohemian. But in 1976, Denison decided, or perhaps it was decided for them, that the house wasn't in good enough repair for anyone to live there. So no one lived there from 76 to 79. It was empty. And then in 1976, we got a new president. Bob Good came to be president. He'd been the ambassador, first appointed ambassador to Zambia. And he came and he and Nancy decided that Monomoy might, should be rescued from the demise that it was falling into, right? So he asked, is it worth preserving for historic reasons? Remember when they tore down Thresher? Yeah, so Bob Good, an ambassador, mind you, let me remind you, he asked everybody, what do you think about this, before he moved his plan forward. And Wally Chessman.
To tear down so prominent a structure brings in history in yet another way. Over the years, Denison has done this to many other buildings to the extent that some observers instinctively react against what they discern as almost an historic pattern of destruction.
All right, so what we're talking about here is, should we tear down Monomoy? And Wally Chessman says, geez, Denison has a kind of a reputation for not paying attention to historic buildings. No, we should not, is the sub-message, right? And it turns out that Bob Good agreed, of course, as the president, and he decided.
It is both campus and residential. It is both town and gown. It makes magnificent use of the green expanse of the lower campus, yet it is in the center of Granville's finest residential street. One day, someday, the president of Denison should live on that corner, whether in Monomoy or in another house. It simply could not be more ideal.
So Bob Good set up a committee, the Monomoy committee. It was made of town and gown. It was chaired by Nancy. And they spent quite a lot of time debating the words restoration, renovation, you know, kind of reconstruction. Like, what is it that we're actually trying to do here? There was a lot of dissent among the Board of Trustees, but they finally ended up in 1979 voting to go ahead and restore Monomoy. And Bob Good hired Robert, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Is it Gaddy? Does anybody know how to pronounce? He's a historic preservationist from Cleveland, to consult with Hardin and Reed, who was the architectural firm in Newark, to do it. And these are the drawings looking east. So where you see that door was previously just 2 windows. And I showed you the picture where I said it needs to be at least power washed. That's the same view. But you see across the top, they decided to replace the missing metal crest up there, and they repointed the brick chimneys and did all kinds of fixes that were definitely necessary. On the inside, fortunately, and I say that with a smile, when Denison turned it into a dorm, they didn't tear out any of the old stuff. They just put up 2x4s and some drywall, right? So when it was time to renovate, they could just take out the bad stuff they had put in, and the good stuff was still there. So it was easier to renovate than one might suspect. Right? And the top left corner, the top left picture, you can see that the drywall is partially torn down. Yeah, here we go. But even the fireplace is original. And I have a few pictures of Bob with Jenny King, and Bob with John Shuck, and Bob and Nancy with John Shuck. And this one in particular I brought up because Nancy Good wrote letters to everybody who had gone to the yard sale in 1934 and bought all the furniture that Denison sold that had been in the house. And this particular curio was bought by Mary Lou Kerner's mother. Then Mary Lou Kerner, who lived in Granville, inherited it. And she gave it to the Granville Historical Society, and the Granville Historical Society loaned it on permanent loan back to the house so it could go back and live in Monomoy. And that actually happened with several pieces of furniture there. Bob and Nancy Good didn't have any money whatsoever. They had a $300,000 budget for the renovation, and the estimate came in at $286,000.37. So they didn't have any money to buy furniture. So that's how they got that. So during the Good years, classes were taught. During the Rocco years, classes were taught. During the Michelle Meyer years, for 10 years there, Michelle and her husband Gail and their kids Erica and David here, they started to use the house to have like meetings and luncheons, and using it as a little bit more prestigious, not only town and gown, but also a way to try to convince people that they should donate to Denison. And there are several pages of that's just a page of 1 week in the life of Monomoy. And then the Noble years, Dale and Tina were here who were at Monomoy for 15 years. And Tina, with a committee, had a real eye for decorating and turned it into kind of a Southern Belle, really beautiful, gorgeous, really gorgeous, gorgeous home. And so I have a couple of pictures from that. Now, Chuck Peterson and I had a little conversation about changing the color of the outside of the house. We have a difference of opinion here. I thought that was great. I think that's not so great, but you know, whatever. And because of the weather, I wasn't able to get an updated picture, but I just wanted you to see, there's the side that we saw the drawing, the architectural drawing of. The house really looks beautiful. It's in great repair. So I'm just going to end by letting you hear the little tribute that a Denison student wrote in 1943. But I want you to ask, those are the 3 eras I've outlined. Now it's housing, alumni and family engagement. And I'm wondering if we couldn't have a discussion about how best could so historic a home be used. I'm wondering, how could it serve town and gown to its better, now that the president has moved across the street and has a different place of residence. I think it should be an ongoing discussion that we have. But I'll play the little ode. Ooh, sorry. It was a Thank you. I know we started late. I'm willing to answer questions if you have any.
When did they tear off the wraparound floor?
In the 50s.
In the 50s?
Mm-hmm. I know some of us are like, what?
So alumni is moving out in the new building, and I have not heard a thing about it.
I haven't either. That's why I think
Nobody knows.
I appreciate that, Marla. That's why I said I think it's time to have a conversation about how best might that.
Nobody knows.
Yeah, yeah, Peter. So, Tina Noble claimed that was the original color of the house because she scraped off some of the white paint, and that's the color that she saw underneath it. She said that to me. That's just not hearsay or rumor around Granville. The problem is the paint colors, when it was painted originally, would have turned that color anyway from oxidation, right? That's not necessarily the original color. Likely not. And we had the same story going on with the Buxton. Do you remember when the Buxton was painted like hot, like sort of this color, remember? And they said that was the original color. I mean, it might have been the original color, but then that it weathered and changed, right? Paint colors change over, 150 years. So the claim is that that was the original color on the base of the house. I'm not sure that that was accurate. Was that a color trio for a house of that era in that time period? None of the pictures in Granville seem to say so, but yeah, there's some reason to believe that was a trio of colors that could have been used on a house like that. But I mean, our pictures are mostly black and white. Marla.
At first I did.
Road is named after Jones Road.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because he owned all that land.
He owned all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else is out there?
He owned all of that land. I haven't updated myself, so this is from memory, but I think everything north of Granville Road, he gave to Sally, and everything south he gave to Virginia, Jenny, his other daughter. But he owned all of that land, all of it. Yeah, he was a collector of land. Well, I mean, when you have $21 million to play with, buy a little here, a little there, who cares? Right? He also, he's the one that had the roads paved. He's the one that put the electric lights in. He's the one that built the Granville Inn. He wanted to build the Granville Inn, and the condition was that he would do that for the village if they would let him build the Granville Inn. So that was about 1924-ish. I mean, the negotiation probably went on between like 21, 22, 23, I don't know, ahead of the building. And the golf course, right? And the golf course. Yep. Thank you. I don't know what happens if I close this. Nothing. Okay. The story of my life in technology.
Okay, thank you very much, Gill. That was, there was a lot of new stuff, yeah. So, and thank you all for coming. We're working on a schedule for a couple programs for February and March. So we'll let you know about those as soon as we've got them squared away. And wanted to encourage you to check out some of our publications. That's one of a source of pride for us, all the publications that we do. And I want to point out that on the second shelf is the all the pocket histories. Number 9 just came out, the one with the light blue color. You should check that one out. That's
Chuck is the author.
It was mine. So, so Memorial Day in Granville, 1873 to 1936. It talks about how the Memorial Day observance, which is incredible. I think a lot of you have been to it, how it all started out and the people who were behind it. So, okay, thank you.
I have a question. You probably don't have the answer, but you might be able to find out. When you talk about money funding